At 58 years old, Jason Statham is the kind of action hero people assume is untouchable, a man of steel, discipline, and relentless focus. To fans, he's the unstoppable force who leaps from skyscrapers, survives explosions, and fights his way through impossible odds with that signature unbreakable stare. But behind the stunts, behind the tough guy persona, and behind the global fame that followed him from the transporter to Fast and Furious, lies a story few people know. A story that is far more painful and far more human than the public ever sees. Because while the world applauds, the action star Jason Statham has become. Almost no one understands the sacrifices he made to get there, or the private struggles he faced on the way up. And now, as he reflects on his journey at 58, he's revealing truths that are as heartbreaking as they are inspiring. Before he was Hollywood's go-to action icon, Jason was a broke teenager selling perfumes in the street, chasing a dream he couldn't even fully see. Before the fame, there were rejections, financial battles, and devastating personal lows he rarely talks about. Even after he became successful, the weight of expectations and the pressure to constantly outdo himself took a toll that no camera ever captured. And now, after nearly 3 decades of nonstop physical work, the emotional and mental wear of a lifetime spent proving himself is finally coming into focus. This is not the Jason Statham fans know from the screen. This is the man behind the myth, and the truth of his journey at 58 is far more heartbreaking than anyone expected. Long before Jason Statham became Hollywood's go-to action star, long before the blockbuster franchises, and long before the world associated his name with grit and power, he was simply a kid from Shirebrook trying to survive a life that offered him very little. What makes his story heartbreaking isn't just what he went through, it's how hard he fought to escape a reality that seemed determined to hold him down. Jason grew up in a working-class family that lived paycheck to paycheck. His father worked odd jobs, street seller, painter, singer, anything to get by. His mother was a dancer who did everything she could to keep her family afloat. Jason loved them deeply, but even as a child he could feel the stress in the walls of their small home. The way money shaped every conversation. Those early years taught him resilience, but they also taught him fear. The kind of fear that comes from watching your parents struggle despite working twice as hard as everyone else did as a teenager. Jason tried to help however he could. He dove into sports diving, football, martial arts, not because he dreamed of fame back then, but because discipline was the only thing in his life that made sense. He trained relentlessly, sometimes spending hours in cold pools or lonely gyms just to drown out the noise of everything else. But even then he knew the odds. Kids from his background didn't become stars. They didn't become champions. They barely got by. He eventually became a nationally ranked diver, but even that achievement brought more frustration than reward. Every competition required money they didn't have: travel, gear, training. Jason often paid for it by selling knockoff perfumes and jewelry on the street. Imagine that, the man who would one day drive armored cars through explosions was once standing on dirty sidewalks trying to convince strangers to buy $5 cologne so he could afford another chance at his dream. And the worst part? He wasn't discovering success, he was discovering disappointment. Sponsorships slipped away. Funding was inconsistent. He made the national team, but never made the Olympics. Every effort, every sacrifice seemed to lead nowhere. The world saw a strong athlete. Jason felt like a failure. That emotional toll stayed with him. He later admitted that during those years he battled a sense of invisibility, a fear that no matter how hard he pushed, his life would always stay small. It's the kind of pain that never fully disappears, even after success finally arrives. Hollywood was never his plan. It wasn't even a possibility. But fate stepped in when he was 31, a moment when most aspiring actors are already giving up. A casting director noticed his raw look, his authenticity, and especially his background as a street seller. They weren't looking for a polished celebrity. They were looking for someone real. Someone who had lived. And Jason had lived through enough hardship to give any character depth. When Guy Ritchie cast him in Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, Jason didn't just play the part of a street hustler, he was one. And audiences felt that. His authenticity, his natural toughness, his emotional control, they all came from years of struggle, fear, and survival. But what people rarely talk about is the cost. Jason didn't enter Hollywood with confidence. He entered with scars, emotional ones. He questioned whether he belonged, whether he was good enough, whether the world would once again pull the rug out from under him. And while his rise felt sudden to audiences, for him it felt like a lifetime of fighting just to be seen. His success wasn't just earned, it was wrestled from a life that constantly told him he wouldn't make it. And as the next chapter of his journey unfolds, the hardships only grow heavier. Jason Statham's climb into Hollywood wasn't the end of his struggles, it was the beginning of a new kind of battle. One far more intense than anything he had faced in his early life. Because while fans saw a rising action hero with effortless charisma and unshakable confidence, Jason saw something very different. Pressure, fear of failure, and a constant need to prove he belonged. After Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, Jason was swept into a whirlwind. Guy Ritchie cast him again, studios took notice, and Hollywood finally discovered an action star who didn't need to pretend to be tough. He was tough. But what people don't understand is how quickly the expectations arrived. Jason was no longer a diver selling perfume on the street. He was suddenly a leading man in an industry that devours its stars the second they slipped out. His breakout role in The Transporter should have been a moment of celebration. And publicly it was. But privately, Jason carried a heavy burden. Because in Hollywood, you're only as good as your last performance. Every film brought new pressure. Bigger stunts, harder fights, higher stakes. And behind each challenge was a brutal truth. If he failed, it wasn't just a movie that flopped. It was his entire life threatening to collapse again. People forget that Jason does most of his own stunts. It's part of what made him iconic. But behind the scenes, it meant endless risk, broken bones, sprains, bruises, close calls that never make the headlines. The audience sees a man leaping from buildings. Jason sees the possibility of injury ending his career overnight. At 58, those fears carry even more weight. But they've existed since his very first action role. He never complained about the physical pain. What hurt more was the emotional pressure. Jason once said that success didn't erase his insecurities, it magnified them. He constantly worried that Hollywood would eventually replace him, that someone younger, stronger, more polished would take his place. And because he wasn't classically trained and didn't come from a wealthy background, he often felt like an outsider pretending to belong to a world that wasn't built for men like him. The loneliness of fame became its own kind of tragedy. During the first decade of his Hollywood career, Jason had almost no time for himself. The non-stop filming schedule, the endless traveling, the intense physical training, all of it left him isolated. His relationships suffered. His friendships faded. He spent more nights in hotel rooms than at home, and the silence of those nights hit him harder than any stunt fall. People assume action stars thrive on adrenaline. But Jason has admitted in interviews that the quiet moments were the hardest. When the cameras shut off and the lights faded, he was left alone with memories of everything he fought to escape. The poverty, the uncertainty, the doubt and a fear that he could lose it all in an instant, and then came the roles that pushed him to his limits. Crank, Death Race, Fast and Furious. The Expendables movies where each scene demanded more danger, more physicality, more endurance. The tragedy isn't that he performed these stunts, it's that he felt he had to. He didn't believe he'd be accepted as a true action star unless he risked everything. Hollywood loved the version of Jason Statham who felt no pain. But Jason Statham, the man, carried more than pain, he carried the weight of survival. And as the years went on, the emotional strain, the physical toll, and the fear of not being enough only intensified, leading to the most heartbreaking chapter of his life. By the time Jason Statham reached the peak of his career, he had become one of the most recognizable action stars in the world. To the public, he was unstoppable, Hollywood's iron-willed warrior who could outrun explosions, defeat villains twice his size, and walk away from danger without a scratch. But behind the cameras, the real Jason was slowly being worn down by a lifetime of pressure, responsibility, and emotional strain that no one around him fully understood. One of the heaviest burdens he carried was the silent toll of the industry he had built his identity around. Years of high-impact stunts, sleepless nights, and relentless training had left their mark on his body. Fans saw perfection. Jason saw limits creeping closer every year. He pushed through pain quietly because he feared the truth. that if he slowed down, even for a moment, Hollywood would leave him behind. And that fear came from a place his audience never saw. A childhood where falling behind meant falling apart, but Jason's greatest hardships weren't physical. What truly weighed on him were the emotional losses he endured along the way. Life in the spotlight meant an endless cycle of beginnings and endings, relationships strained by distance, friendships lost to the pace of his schedule, family moments he missed because he was half a world away shooting another film. There were days he woke up in hotel rooms, with no idea what city he was in. Days when the applause of millions only made the silence afterward feel louder. Fame isolated him more than it connected him. The more successful he became, the fewer people he could truly trust. Everyone wanted something: access, opportunity, attention. Genuine connection became rare, and the loneliness that followed was something he never admitted publicly. Then came the moments that broke him in ways no injury ever could. Jason watched close friends in the stunt and action world suffer devastating injuries. He attended funerals for people who had risked their lives bringing action movies to life. Each loss carved a scar in him, a reminder that behind the adrenaline and excitement, the industry carried consequences few outside it ever saw. He carried survivor's guilt, a quiet grief he rarely acknowledged. And his sense of responsibility only grew heavier after he became a father. Suddenly, the risks that once seemed thrilling became terrifying. Every stunt, every dangerous scene, every moment hanging off a moving vehicle came with the thought, what if I don't make it home? Jason has said privately that fatherhood changed everything: his priorities, his fears, even the way he viewed his own mortality. The man who once sought danger suddenly felt the weight of needing to stay alive for someone else. This internal conflict, wanting to protect his family while being labeled Hollywood's most fearless star, became one of the greatest emotional battles of his life. Because the industry expected him to stay invincible. The audience expected him to stay young. The studios expected him to stay strong. But Jason, at 58, was simply human, tired, aching, and quietly haunted by decades of pressure he could no longer outrun. The tragedy isn't that Jason Statham became an action hero. The tragedy is that the world fell in love with the version of him who never broke, never hesitated, never felt pain, while the real man was carrying more than anyone ever knew. And as he moved into the later years of his career, another chapter unfolded, one that forced him to confront everything he tried to ignore. As Jason Statham approaches the later years of his career, something unexpected has begun happening behind the scenes, something far more emotional and revealing than any role he has ever played. For the first time, Jason has been forced to slow down. Not because he wants to, but because his mind and body, after decades of punishing work, are demanding it. And in that slowing down, a truth he avoided for years has finally caught up with him. The life he built came with a cost he can no longer ignore. At 58, Jason is confronting a reality he once believed he could outrun. The physical toll of decades of stunts, slamming into cars, leaping from rooftops, fighting through scenes take after take, has accumulated into a quiet storm. He doesn't complain publicly. He never has. But those closest to him see it: the stiffness in the mornings, the careful way he moves when the cameras aren't rolling, the injuries that take longer to heal. The world still calls him invincible. Jason knows better. What hurts even more, though, is the emotional toll. For the first time in his life, he's asking questions he once pushed aside. Who am I when I'm not the tough guy on screen? What happens when the roles stop coming? What have I lost by dedicating my life to being unbreakable? These questions hit him hardest when he looks at his son. Becoming a father changed everything. Suddenly, the man who once dove headfirst into danger now feels the weight of every risk. He thinks about the future. He thinks about presence. He thinks about all the nights, all the years, all the moments he traded away to build a career the world celebrates but few understand. In private, Jason has admitted that he fears disappointing the people he loves. He fears being remembered only as a character, not as a man. For someone who spent half his life fighting to be seen, it is an almost unbearable irony. Yet the most heartbreaking part is this: Jason Statham has never truly believed he deserved the love he has today. His childhood struggles, his years of rejection, his long battle with self-doubt, they left wounds he carried into adulthood. The world sees confidence. Jason sees the boy who sold perfume on the streets, trying to help his parents survive. And no amount of fame can fully erase that past. But despite all the pain, all the pressure, all the emotional weight he has carried alone, there is something powerful emerging from this new chapter of Jason's life, something that transforms his tragedy into something meaningful. Jason has begun to accept himself. He has started choosing time with his family over another dangerous action role. He has begun producing films that focus on story rather than stunt spectacle. He has quietly donated to programs supporting young athletes from disadvantaged backgrounds, kids who remind him of the boy he used to be. And he has surrounded himself with people who love him not for the characters he plays, but for the man he truly is. For the first time, he is prioritizing peace over pressure. Jason Statham's tragedy isn't the physical pain, it isn't the loneliness of early fame, it isn't the toll of decades in an unforgiving industry. The tragedy is that it took him nearly 6 decades to finally realize he was enough, even without the stunts, without the toughness, without the armor the world expected him to wear. But the hope, the beauty, lies in what comes next. He is entering a stage of life where he finally allows himself to breathe, to be present, to embrace fatherhood, love, and purpose, to build a legacy not defined by danger but by strength of character. Jason Statham's story is heartbreaking, but it is also inspiring, because his greatest victory was never surviving Hollywood. It was surviving himself.